Hi, I'm Robin Suggs, and our first candidate today for our propagation workshop is a woodland medicinal called black cohosh. I'm standing behind some specimens that I planted maybe 7 or 8 years ago. They're grown from root divisions, which is a pretty common way of propagating black cohosh. These specimens, this particular one is maybe as tall as I am. They've done quite well. This is a typical situation where you may find it growing in the wild under some tall poplar trees. And so these obviously have been sited very well. As you can see, they're healthy, green, look nice for like late May in North Carolina. As I mentioned, we're in western North Carolina with black cohosh. We're about 2,000 feet, late May. It's, I guess it's a pretty typical specimen. We've had kind of a cool spring. But this flower head is about as tall as I am. I'm about 6'1". Sometimes these range a little taller, but as you can see, these are the future flowers. In about maybe, I don't know, 3-4 weeks, these will be tall spikes, white spikes in the woodland. That's really probably the best way to identify black cohosh, especially at a distance. The tall white flower spikes, the characteristic foliage, and we can use that to separate it from some lookalikes. Okay, now I'm over in the woods next to a black cohosh lookalike called Doll's Eye or Baneberry. Okay, and you can see that besides the I guess diminutive stature compared to the black cohosh we looked at earlier, we have a little different structure up here with what was the flower part earlier and the beginnings of the berries, as you can see in my hand. But as you can also see, the leaves are very similar to black cohosh. So be on the watch for this one if you are collecting germplasm of black cohosh. This is one you don't want. Okay, now I'm standing behind another, what some people would say a black cohosh lookalike. To me, the top of this plant does not look as much like black cohosh as the baneberry does. This is a plant called false goat's beard. That's a tongue twister. False goat's beard. Astilbe biternata, I believe, or biternata, depending on your Latin. The foliage is compound, like black cohosh, but you'll notice this flower is very different. It's a very plume-like flower. So this is a dead giveaway. Sometimes what's not a dead giveaway is in the fall, if you're collecting these plants for germplasm, when you dig these up, the rhizomes look a lot like black cohosh rhizomes. So be aware of that. Maybe, now's a good point to make a suggestion. You want to mark these while they're growing, while the tops are visible. Make sure you mark them before you dig. Okay, so here we are on a wooded acre of our farm in western North Carolina, and I'm standing behind some wild black cohosh plants, some nice specimens. Probably can't see much behind me or over to my side, but these woods are full with native black cohosh, and also, not coincidentally, pawpaw trees. Here, that's a good indicator species. But if you do need to collect germplasm from a wild site, you want to make sure that you do proper identification and you collect from a healthy population, and preferably plants that are mature enough to bloom and set seed. Okay, so I just mentioned some things that you want to look for if you're harvesting germplasm from the wild. If you've got undisturbed woodlands like this where the plants are not threatened, and you have no other choice but to collect your own germplasm, you want to make sure that you collect, like I say, from mature specimens, plants that are large enough to fruit, flower, fruit, seed, reproduce sexually, as these are. This also helps with your identification, being able to find these populations when these bloom heads are present. Like I say, it's May, they're just now forming. It's almost June. But those are some things you want to look for when you're identifying your wild sites for collection. So ideally, once you identify your population for collection of germplasm, whether it's seed, which obviously the seed needs to be present, which would be late summer, early fall, or rhizome, and again, preferably the best time for that, for the digging of the rhizome, would be late summer, early fall. You want to make sure that these plants are large enough to harvest and the population is heavy, or healthy rather, and there are large enough numbers to collect from. If you're buying germplasm from a nursery or from another source, you kind of have to trust the material that they're sending you. But the main thing is, once these plants set seed, allow those seed to fall. You've already let those plants reproduce sexually. So at least you've done something to ensure the survival of this particular plant. And those are the types you need to think about when you're collecting from the wild. Okay, so what you see behind me is a property adjacent to ours where there's been a lot of wholesale destruction and devastation. The reason I'm showing this is if you're looking for populations of plants, whether they be black cohosh like this specimen here that survived the bulldozer, and there's a few more around here, or any kind of forest botanicals, if you can find an area like this before it becomes like this, this may be a good candidate site for collection. Because these plants, you know, really and truly, you can't dig, you know, as many in a lifetime as a bulldozer can take out in an afternoon. So rather than destroy these, let's use them. Like I was saying, this black cohosh in this area of slash from a logging site is hanging on. This may have been a good candidate and still may be for harvest. You may want to leave these survivors in areas that may not be disturbed again for future regeneration. But like I say, there's some areas I'll show you in a minute where definitely these huge populations of black cohosh, things like bloodroot, Solomon seal, ginseng, blue mayapple, forest botanicals have just been completely wiped out by the development of logging roads and winnowing of this slash. So again, just to reiterate, in terms of looking for potential collection sites for germplasm, if you are digging from the wild, the forest behind me, one managed by yours truly, is a site where it's protected. The black cohosh, the bloodroot, ginseng, nothing much is going to happen to it as long as I have control over it, pay the property taxes, make the mortgage, that sort of thing. So this is a forest managed by forest farmers, wild harvesters. And what we have here, in contrast with what we just saw, is land ravaged by logging. Okay? Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that most of the plant life here has been destroyed. It'll take generations to regenerate rather. And so, if I were, in hindsight, if I were to look for a place to collect germplasm, I may have come in here before the timber crew did and collect germplasm from a site like this. Okay? Alright, so the rain's broken for a little bit. I found a black cohosh here in a four-wheeler trail. It's not a big one, but I'm going to go ahead and dig this because it'll be run over all summer. So join me here digging this black cohosh. This is a freshly dug black cohosh that we've just rescued from a four-wheeler trail. And you'll notice there are a few little plants like this foam flower growing in. We'll plant back. Hopefully the four-wheeler will see them. And what we're going to do, we're going to cut this current season's growth. Now, keep in mind that we may normally be doing this in the late summer, early fall, or early spring, okay? This is probably not the best time to do this unless you're doing a rescue like we are here in this four-wheeler trail. This is pretty simple. I'm going to walk toward the camera just a little bit and show you this rhizome we've just dug. And what you'll notice is that there are quite a few buds along the top of this rhizome. And when we're doing rhizome divisions, you want to make sure you have at least one bud per division. And even this small rhizome, we can get quite a few divisions. So we're going to take this back to the garden and we're going to plant this. Okay, now we're back at the homestead and we've got our black cohosh rhizome. Like I say, normally you would be doing this in the fall and dormant months, but in a situation where you're doing a rescue or the plant is in harm's way, you might as well go ahead and dig it for propagation purposes. Now, what I like to do with these divisions is simply to break them up. And you see, here's a little plantlet right here, ready to go. And something as small, maybe not that, but something as small as that. And that. We've got our pruners here. We'll take a little help. Like I say, I like to break them up, take advantage of the natural splits. So now we have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably 6 divisions from a small plant. Let's take these over here in the woodland garden and plant them up. So now we're going to plant these rootlets in the woodland garden. These divisions are going to go in the ground with the buds pointed up. Cover them with maybe an inch or so of soil. And you'll notice we're planting here amongst some Solomon seal. Typically a good indicator of a suitable site for black cohosh. And we've still got 2 more to go, and it's just that simple. So we're just finishing up planting these last 2 divisions among the Solomon seal. Like I say, the main thing is to make sure that the buds are pointing up. These mosquitoes are having a heyday right now. All right. Now we're done. We've got 6 plants where we had 1. Wow. Now I know how Guatemala feels. It's really hot and humid. But we've got those 6 divisions in the ground. And you'll probably want to water those in now, but it's just that simple. Now keep in mind, when you plant these during the growing season, oftentimes it's not, they may lay dormant in the soil till next season to come up. You may get some top growth, but if you don't freak out. They should come up again next spring, depending on how late in the season you've done this. Okay, so now that we've done some vegetative propagation of black cohosh with rhizome divisions, um, let's look at what might be involved with seed propagation. As I mentioned before and shown before, this is a black cohosh plant. This one's is tall, if not taller than I am. Again, late May in western North Carolina. These blooms are just getting ready to form. You can see here. This is where you'll come back in the late summer, early fall and collect your seed from where these blooms are right now. So we've got this plant ID'd correctly. You might want to mark it with a flag, come back later in the season and collect seed. Next we're going to look at what we do with those seeds. One thing I also wanted to bring up is that I was fortunate enough to find this old seed head from black cohosh. This is something we've not seen so far in the webinar, but this is last year's seed. I don't know that there are any seed actually still in here. Actually there are. I don't know if you can see these, but there are a few seed there. Okay, and here's one way we can plant them. We can scatter them on the ground, and they probably will come up next spring if they're still viable. But they've been out here in these capsules all winter, and you know, what the heck, give it a try. But the best time to collect these seed would be late summer, early fall. Okay, so now we're out in the field, and we're going to talk a little bit about propagation of passion flower. Unfortunately, here it's now early June in western North Carolina, and unfortunately, passion flower is not really up yet. So we're going to have to wing this a little bit. We do have a little bit of emergence, but normally passion flower this time of year in this location would be maybe 6 to 18 inches tall. They would have a little bit more to go on. We're going to plow around through the grass and prowl a little bit and see if we can find some passion flower shoots. And at that point, we're going to dig up some rhizomes and take it from there. Okay, so now we have located our subject, and this is very small early growth passion flower, and took a little while to prowl through the grass here and find a shoot or two. And so this is kind of in the way because this is an area that's mowed, so we're going to dig this up and we're going to use this for propagation material. Okay, now that I've located the passion flower, I'm going to dig around with this digging fork. And I like to use a fork for this because the roots and rhizomes a lot of times will slide in here, and we're not cutting things up that we don't want to cut up. Okay, what we have here is a small passion flower rhizome. So this is passion flower rhizome with the top growth. Unfortunately, we didn't get a whole lot, but normally what we want to do is find a piece of rhizome. We had a few of these shoots along the rhizome, and where we could divide these and still retain both shoot and root. This piece voluntarily came off when we were doing some digging, came off of here. Normally, we probably would, this may or may not produce top growth. Looks like this one will. Let me get close to the camera. Can we see this? You see that bud right there? Okay. If you plant this and that bud's sticking up, you'll have another plant. Okay, so what we have here is a close-up shot of this rhizome. And I don't know if you can see it, but along this rhizome, there are some little green buds here. And there's a little brown bud, not quite green. Probably hasn't received any light. But if we take and make our division just above, this bud and plant this piece, we should get another plant. Certainly, we'll have this plant, okay? It has shoot and root attached. And this root, a piece of rhizome, I think we've got enough bud here to give this a go. So we'll plant these 3 and have 3 where we had 1. So what we have here is a weedy bed of Jerusalem artichoke, and we're going to create a true polyculture with this passion flower that will trail up into the Jerusalem artichokes, hopefully before these gnats devour me completely. Let's take a look. Okay, so we're going to sink this back into the ground, maybe a little deeper than where it originally grew. And we're going to do the same for these other 2 roots. Okay, so we have 3 rhizomes planted in this weedy bed of Jerusalem artichoke. They'll be fine. Okay, some of y'all might be wondering why I'm out here putting cages around tomatoes in discussion of propagation and growing passion flower. Well, let me give you some insight here in just a second. So what we have here, obviously, are tomatoes and not passion flower. But it's a system very similar to one I developed from wild yam several years ago, where you had, in the case of wild yam, a plant growing for its roots. In the case of passion flower, we've got a perennial vining herb that is grown primarily for its aerial parts, the herb, leaves, flowers, that sort of thing. We won't be digging those up at the end of the season. So we can use something like a permanent mulch, like this nursery row cover I have here for these tomatoes. Cut holes in it, put your passion flower, and then you'll need a support for the vining aerial portions of the plant. And for me, this concrete reinforcing wire, rolled and interlocked, works just great. What we're going to do next is going to be dependent on the type of seed that you're sowing. I've had lots of experience with black cohosh seed, not so much with passion flower, but as a rule of thumb, most plants, perennials especially, trees, shrubs that are native to temperate climates, in other words, climates that have distinct seasons, cold winters, hot summers, most of those seeds need to go through a period of what we call cold moist stratification, or in some cases like ginseng, they need a period of cold moist stratification, warm moist stratification, cold moist stratification, and then 18 months after they're sown, they germinate. Not so complicated with black cohosh or passion flower. But you'll need to do a little research on the species that you're sowing seed for to find out if the seed needs stratification, and we'll talk about stratification here in just a second. So one other point I'd like to make about seed propagation, especially if you're collecting your own seed, has to do with storage and how much time you have between the time you collect seed and the time you plant them. I have an orange and a seed pod from a redbud tree, Cercis canadensis. And the reason I have these is these seed forming this pod on the redbud tree, this pod matures, it dries up, the seed are shed, and this orange has seed, obviously, inside the orange, although this one may not, it's a navel orange, but most oranges do have seed. And these seeds are kept in a moist environment inside the fruit. So pay attention to how the seed are offered to you. Generally, seed that come in a moist, fleshy surrounds, like this orange fruit or ginseng berries, need to be kept moist from the time that they're harvested to the time they're planted. Not so much seed like these that dry out. One more thing about seed propagation that I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on is the issue of stratification. You know, we spoke about plants that are native to temperate climates, climates that have distinct changes in seasons, needing to go through a cold, moist period to break dormancy. As I said, that's generally the case, and the way we talked about earlier in addressing that was by planting in a seed flat, putting the seed flat outside in a protected area, maybe covering with some leaves, some hardware cloth to keep rodents from getting in there, and so on and so forth. But there is another way that we can get around that issue and to address the needs for stratification and breaking the dormancy in the seed. Another way we can accomplish stratification is to do it inside in your refrigerator. And the reason I'm holding this little baggie here is we have some false unicorn seed that we ordered from a local seed supplier this spring, and these were shipped dry in a seed packet. And so if we planted those in the spring, much like if we received dry black cohosh seed in the spring, or a lot of plant seed in the spring that are from temperate areas, these seed probably would not germinate immediately. So we're going to shortcut the outside stratification process in our home refrigerator. And it's just that simple. We take these out of the refrigerator in 45 to 60 days, we plant them, and if we've got enough warm weather in the season, which in this case we will with these seeds have been refrigerated for a few weeks now, so they'll come out in about a month or less, maybe about a month, and we'll plant them up, and by late summer we should have seedlings, and by fall we may have seedlings big enough to put into individual cells, or at that point, if they're not big enough to put in individual cells, we can overwinter them in a nursery bed in the flat until next spring, when then we move them up into individual cells. So what I've done is simply taken some damp milled sphagnum moss, the same sphagnum moss that we maybe lined over the top of the seeds or covered the seed with when I was demonstrating the planting. And we put seed, or dry seed, in this damp sphagnum moss. And when I mean damp, you want to moisten it, squeeze it out like you squeeze a sponge, and then mix them with the seed. Put them in a little baggie like this, little plastic bag, seal it up, and keep it in your refrigerator for about 45 to maybe 60 days, then plant. Okay, now we're going to talk about seed propagation. We're assuming we've already collected the seed of black cohosh, and we'll also be working, in theory at least, with passion flower for this webinar segment. But the things I'm going to go over will be pretty general recommendations for any kind of seed propagation. You'll see what I have laid out in front of me. I've got an all-duty soilless mix. I've got some milled sphagnum moss and some various seed flats and containers. I'll go into detail and explain each one of these components in just a bit. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is our substrate or mix that we're going to use for planting the seeds. What I've got here is a pretty typical, fairly lightweight nursery mix. You'll notice there's some composted pine bark, there's some vermiculite, there's undoubtedly peat moss, some coarse sand, so on and so forth. I prefer a light nursery mix for our purposes over a standard seedling soilless mix. This is a little more coarse, and the reason I don't like a lot of the more finely milled seed mixes is because they don't tend to last very long. 2 to 3 months production time is really what they're designed for, and we're going to take a little longer in our seed production. So now we're going to fill up this flat, or maybe almost fill up this flat with this nursery mix. Alrighty then, it's raining again, fancy that. Here we have our seed flat, nursery flat, whatever you want to call it, filled with our relatively lightweight nursery mix. I want to smooth this out as much as possible, and typically we sow our seed here, cover them up with a little bit more mix, and I'm going to explain a few variations of that process here today. Number one, sometimes for really fine seed, we want to mix the seed together in some damp milled sphagnum and then use that to sow the seed and the milled sphagnum on the very top of this nursery mix. The nice thing about this milled sphagnum is it has antimicrobial properties and it keeps seed from rotting. It also inhibits damping off on seedlings. So if you've got some tricky seedlings, tricky plants, you may want to add a little insurance with this this sphagnum moss, this milled sphagnum moss. Now, when we're working with fine seed like black cohosh, sometimes getting them evenly distributed over the seedling flat can be a little difficult. So what I like to do is take the seeds and put them in a little bit of soilless mix, either the same mix we're using here or a moistened milled sphagnum moss. Either one works fine, but you know, trickier seed, things a little more difficult, you may want to use this. But most seed, for our purposes, we're going to use some of this soilless mix, and we'll take and we'll mix the seed very well, hopefully not spilling it. Mix it very well, and then we'll take and we'll sow the seed in the flat like so. Okay? Okay. Now, if we have larger seed like passion flower seed that you can see once it is on the surface of the seedling mix, you can go ahead and sow that. You can see it, you can see how well it's distributed. And then you'll just take your nursery mix or your soilless media and evenly distribute it. Tamp it down and water it in, okay? Now, one of the probably easiest ways to stratify seed is to sow them immediately in a forest or in a field or in a permanent bed where you're going to be growing them in the fall or summer when they're collected. Most of the time they'll come up the next spring. Not all seeds, some seeds are just slower to take off than others. Some seedlings are slower growing than others. Some species are slower growing. So most of woodland botanicals are pretty slow growing from seed. Passion flower, not so much so, but what I might do with either one is to take our seeded flat, and what we're going to do, we're going to take it to a area that we're going to overwinter this. And we're going to take and maybe put something like hardware cloth over it. Doesn't need to be a structure like this. It could be just flat hardware cloth. This is something I made for a different purpose. And then we're just going to want to cover this with leaf litter. And then next spring, early spring, we're going to pull this out and we're going to let the seeds germinate. So what do we do with our seedlings the next spring when they germinate? Again, most of these woodland botanicals, most medicinal species can be a little slow, not all, but many can be a little slow to get started. So next spring after these germinate, you're going to have a flat covered with seedlings if you've done your job correctly. And so most of the time what we do in a nursery is we take this same soilless mix and we put them into these cell trays, okay? And in each one of these cells, we'll fill each one up with a soilless mix, and we will prick each seedling out and plant it in each one of these cells and grow this in the nursery for a season. Then maybe the next fall or the next spring, sing them out in their permanent home. Okay, so these are some large black cohosh that were planted in a polycultural agroforestry setting, multi-story cropping setting. I just call it a woods grown or a woods culture setting. But these are planted among pawpaw trees, and I'll show you in a minute exactly how these things line up. But this is one way that you can grow black cohosh in a production, and it's a little more, a little more biodiverse setting than under artificial shade, something like that. But these are simply planted in the rows of the pawpaws, which I'll show you in a second. Now, as you can see, these black cohosh are planted in this row of pawpaw trees. And you can do that for a lot of species, whether it's black cohosh, ginseng, golden seal, any shade-loving perennial, forest perennial that you want to grow, you can plant amongst these row of trees, in this case pawpaws, and you have a little more biodiverse setting for production.